President Trump fights new battles on several fronts. I'm Margaret Brennan in Washington. I'm in today for Elaine Quijano, and this is Red and Blue. Ahead on this program, President Trump hits the road to promote the Republicans' contentious plan to overhaul Obamacare. Can he sell Americans and members of his own party on the bill? And a look at the long list of challenges awaiting Secretary of State Rex Tillerson as he makes his first journey to Asia as America's chief diplomat, doing that without any press. But first, President Trump is slamming the federal judge in Hawaii who blocked his revised immigration order Wednesday night, previously known as the travel ban, and it would have taken effect within hours.
A judge has just blocked our executive order on travel and refugees coming into our country from certain countries. The order he blocked was a watered-down version of the first order that was also blocked by another judge and should have never been blocked to start with. This is, in the opinion of many, an unprecedented judicial overreach. The law and the Constitution give the president the power to suspend immigration when he deems, or she, fortunately it will not be Hillary she. This ruling makes us look weak, which, by the way, we no longer are, believe me. Just look at our borders. This is a watered-down version. And let me tell you something, I think we ought to go back to the first one and go all the way, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. We're going to apply common sense, we're going to apply intelligence, and we're never quitting, and we're never going away, and we're never, ever giving up. The best way to keep foreign terrorists, or as some people would say, in certain instances, radical Islamic terrorists from attacking our country, is to stop them from entering our country in the first place.
The president made those remarks in Nashville in his speech billed as a sales pitch for the House Republican measure to replace the Affordable Care Act. You know it as Obamacare. But as we saw, President Trump is facing fights on several fronts. The health care bill he went to Nashville to sell faces increasing pushback from members of his own party, forcing leaders to signal that they might change parts of the bill. Now the president faces new questions on another front about his own finances after his 2005 tax returns were leaked. The top Republican on the House Intelligence Committee today publicly rebuked the president's claim that he'd been wiretapped by President Obama. We begin with those comments from Republican Congressman Devin Nunes.
We don't have any evidence that that took place. And in fact, I don't believe, just in the last week of time, the people we've talked to, I don't think there was an actual tap of Trump Tower. So now you have to decide, as I mentioned to you last week, are you going to take the tweets literally? And if you are, then clearly the president was wrong. But if you're not going to take the tweets literally, and if there's a concern that the president has about other people, other surveillance activities, looking at him or his associates, either appropriately or inappropriately, we want to find that out.
That comes as President Trump made his first comments about the issue since he claimed he was wiretapped more than a week ago. He says he got his evidence in part from the New York Times.
A tweet, the former administration wiretapped me, surveilled me at Trump Tower during the last election. How did you find out? You said, I just found out. How did you learn that?
I've been reading about things. I read in, I think it was January 20th, a New York Times article where they were talking about wiretapping. There was an article, I think they used that exact term. I read other things. I watched your friend Bret Baier the day previous where he was talking about certain very complex sets of things happening, and wiretapping. I said, wait a minute, there's a lot of wiretapping being talked about. I've been seeing a lot of things.
Why not wait to tweet about it until you can prove it? Don't you devalue your words when you can't provide evidence?
Because the New York Times wrote about it. You know, not that I respect the New York Times. I call it the failing New York Times. But they did write on January 20th using the word wiretap. Other people have come out with
right, but you're the president. You have the ability to gather all the evidence you want.
I do, but I think that, frankly, we have a lot right now. And don't forget, when I say wiretap, those words were in quotes. That really covers, because wiretapping is pretty old-fashioned stuff, but that really covers surveillance and many other things. And nobody ever talks about the fact that it was in quotes, but that's a very important thing. But wiretap covers a lot of different things. I think you're going to find some very interesting items coming to the forefront over the next 2 weeks.
Also today, FBI Director James Comey was on Capitol Hill for a closed-door briefing with members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley urged Comey to speak to members about the state of the investigation into Trump campaign contacts with Russia, as well as the possibility of any wiretaps on Trump associates. Now, Comey did not speak to reporters, but earlier on Wednesday, his boss, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, did.
Did you ever have a chance to brief the president on investigations related to the campaigns, or did you ever give him any reason to believe that he was wiretapped by the previous administration?
Look, the answer is no.
The FBI director returns to Capitol Hill on Monday when he is expected to testify publicly before the House Intelligence Committee in the first hearing into Russia's meddling in the election. But the top Republican and the top Democrat on that committee are still at odds over one of the investigation's central questions.
Is there anything you've seen in the evidence so far that suggests that there were any conversations between people affiliated with the Trump campaign, Russian officials who are not the ambassador to Russia, anyone other tied to the Kremlin had conversations with the Trump campaign? Any evidence?
Not that I'm aware of.
You know, I wouldn't answer that question as categorically as my colleague, and you know, we're not privileged to talk about the contents of the investigation, but I think we need to be very precise when we talk about this, and I just don't think we can answer categorically and not in this forum.
So what are the key things we still don't know about the president's wiretap claims and about potential contacts between Trump allies and Russian officials? Our Nancy Cordes breaks down the outstanding questions.
House Intelligence Chairman Devin Nunes was pretty categorical. He says not only does he not see any evidence that President Obama spied on President Trump, but he point blank does not think it ever happened. But a number of other lawmakers aren't so sure. They still want the FBI director to come forward and say, possibly publicly, what he knows. They really want to get to the bottom of whether this claim is made up by the president, because that would be troubling, or whether it actually happened. And there is some evidence, which would also be extremely troubling and, of course, unprecedented. So you had the chair of a judiciary subcommittee today, Lindsey Graham, arguing that this is of such import to the American people that the FBI director needs to come forward and say publicly what he knows. You had the FBI director actually called up once again to Capitol Hill by the Senate Judiciary Chairman, Chuck Grassley, who had his own questions and who threatened to hold up a Department of Justice nominee until Comey came and answered those questions. He said he was, quote, very irritated that he hadn't heard from Comey yet. So this entire controversy has put the FBI director in a very delicate position. He doesn't want to appear to be taking sides, especially when there may be an ongoing investigation into ties between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives, and certainly investigations ongoing into Russia's meddling in the U.S. election. But at the same time, there is a great deal of pressure from Republicans and Democrats alike for some kind of definitive analysis of what Donald Trump meant when he said that he was wiretapped by his predecessor, and whether there's any validity to it at all.
Susan Page and Mark Leibovich are here in studio with me. Susan, of course, is the Washington bureau chief for USA Today, and Mark is the CBS News political contributor and the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. Thank you both for being here. A lot to chew on, particularly after that rally. Those are always colorful, but I want to stay on topic here with the latest on this allegation of wiretapping. March 20th, we get the first public hearing. Now we get another one, March 28th. What is happening here? Is the president continuing to have to face these questions, or is the story dying out?
I think it's pretty clear this story is not going to die until there is a definitive answer about.
Will we ever get one?
But I think we see. I thought we saw tonight President Trump trying to begin the walk back by saying wiretapping can mean a lot of things. This is sort of like what we heard Sean Spicer say a day before when he said that wiretapping was in quotes. When President Trump, I thought that was an effort to say, well, maybe it wasn't wiretapping, maybe it was something else.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is like a pure self-inflicted wound. I mean, the Russia thing was there. I mean, that was building up over several months, but this just came out of nowhere. It was a tweet. And I think what you're seeing, like in this whole confluence of stories around even the travel ban, healthcare, this tweet about the wiretapping, is that these are the kind of accountable moments the presidents have. He actually said something, and here we are 10, 11 days later. People in both parties, people who he'd think would be his allies, people who he would think would back off on this, are pressing him. And I think it's probably very annoying for him. And clearly it's getting in the way of a larger message he should be selling.
You know, and it's a new experience, I think, because I think as a candidate, you can ignore it or double down, and eventually we all move on to another thing. This wasn't just a provocative charge. This was an accusation of the most serious kind of action that a president could take against his successor, against a major presidential candidate during campaign. This is a really serious issue in a way that maybe Donald Trump did not fully understand when he sent out that tweet.
And it kicks up a lot of dust around what should be a significant probe related to the intelligence community's findings about Russian meddling and fleshing that out for the American public. I want to come back to this, but I want to go to the field right now where we have CBS's Major Garrett, because I want to talk about the president's comments there. Major, you have been to so many of these rallies. You know them best. I mean, what was the sense today? Was the president more subdued? Was he angered by the news of that travel ban? He was supposed to be there on a sales mission.
Sure. He was originally slotted to be here in Nashville to talk about the repeal and replace efforts for the Affordable Care Act. That got shoved aside by the court ruling, the temporary restraining order from that federal district judge in Hawaii. And the president talked at great length about immigration generally and that judicial action specifically. And I can tell you the biggest applause and the loudest roars from not a total capacity crowd, but a near capacity crowd, all dealt with immigration. There's certainly some fervor here to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, but the president did not make an elaborate pitch for the people here to do anything in particular or rally support or help out in any particular way. That sort of was a kind of afterthought to the overall presentation, which was much more focused on stronger border security, his executive orders, and other actions taken under the larger umbrella of border security and national security. And it wasn't that long ago that Kellyanne Conway, a counselor to the president, introduced this concept of alternative facts. Well, if I could make one observation here in Nashville at this rally of Trump supporters, it would be they live and are happily existing in an alternative universe. Everything this president says to them, they responded to positively. They see this president fulfilling his campaign promises. They don't see any of the Washington difficulties, static, loss of momentum. They don't perceive it at all. They perceive that this president is not only doing what he said he would do, but making their country a better place to live in. And that's why the president, like many of his predecessors, loves to be out with his supporters to feel that adoration. That does not mean that the universe of Washington is any less hostile than Mark just referred to, or any less threatening to what the president wants to accomplish when it comes to health care, his tax reform, or anything else. Because right now, all of these various issues you just touched on in the opening, Margaret, are causing him real damage in Washington, where he has to operate and he has to win votes, retain credibility, and move his presidency forward. And all the things that you have just dissected, and are going to dissect more as this broadcast goes on, are problematic for the president on that score.
Well, exactly that, Major. I mean, America First is a great bumper sticker. It is certainly a campaign slogan that really worked in that room you were in tonight. But when it comes to governing and legislating, things seem a bit messier here in Washington. We had the vice president on Capitol Hill again today trying to make another direct sales pitch. He did that earlier in Kentucky over the weekend as well. Let's listen in to some of that sound we have.
Obamacare won't be around for a year or two. It's gone. So it's not like, oh, gee, they have this. Obamacare is gone. Premiums will continue to soar, double digits and even triple digits in many cases. It will drain our budget and destroy our jobs. Remember all of the broken promises? You can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan. Remember the wise guy? Remember the wise guy that essentially said, the American people, the so-called architect, the American people are stupid because they approved it? We're going to show them. Those in Congress who made these promises have no credibility whatsoever on health care.
Major, do you have any sense of the people who turn out to this Trump rally, if they have a real priority set for what they want Speaker Ryan or President Trump to come up with in this health care bill?
No, they just want to get it done, and on the president's terms. And if the president says the final product is okay, they're going to be just fine with that, which does give the president some flexibility and some political room to maneuver. But the simple fact of the matter is this. 1 week ago, this legislation was introduced. The president endorsed it as written. And starting on Monday, when the White House began to say, you know, we're not saying this is the only vehicle, and then by Tuesday, well, we're interested in a manager's amendment. We might amend it once on the House floor. Now the House Republican leadership is talking about significant potential alterations to the legislation. Why is this happening? Because it doesn't have the votes. The president's endorsement was not enough to take the skeptics either in the moderate wing of the House Republican Conference or the much more conservative wing, the so-called Freedom Caucus members, to move them behind the president's position. So in that original and initial foray, by saying, I'm the president, this is what I want, I expect you to support it, significant numbers, large enough to defeat the bill within the House Republican Conference have said, Mr. President, respectfully, no. We need to crack this bill open and get some of our ideas in there and redraft it from what the leadership presented and what you endorsed. That process may unravel the entire legislative momentum, such as it was behind this bill. Because that's what tends to happen when everyone starts getting in there and throwing in their ideas and trying to change an intricately built legislative product in the first place. I'm not predicting this is not going to work, but it is in much greater jeopardy 1 week now than it was a week ago. And that's a simple legislative and political fact.
Major Garrett, thank you for joining us there right after that Trump rally in Nashville. And I want to come back now to our panel, of course. Mark, you just heard everything Major laid out there. In any other administration, and Susan chime in on this too, you would send out the president to be the closer. What Major just described is not a closing argument. It's sort of the middle of a negotiation, and yet the sales pitch has begun.
Right.
What's the calculus?
Well, the calculus, well, first of all, a couple of things. First, I don't fully buy the bifurcated view that this is just a Washington sensibility here, and when you go out into, the real world, no one cares about CBO scores, no one cares about congressional debate and so forth. I mean, this is a very real issue, and if you look at polls, I mean, there is a much greater support for the Affordable Care Act than there was, a couple of years ago, and a great deal of ambivalence over how President Trump is handling this health care debate. I mean, there was a couple polls out today that put him in the 30s on this. The other thing is, the notion that he is doing exactly what he said he was going to do is fine sort of tonally, but his biggest applause lines on the campaign were, lock her up. I mean, that's not happening. I'm going to get rid of Obamacare.
The campaign's over, right?
The campaign's over.
He won.
Build a wall. I mean, unclear if that's going to happen. We're going to get rid of we're going to get rid of Obamacare so fast. Whatever happens, it's not going to be so fast, and it's much more complicated than that. So we'll see. I think there's a certain energy that is reflected in these rallies that mimics what he had during the campaign. But the substance of it and him actually delivering on promises, I think, very much remains to be seen.
You know, I'm not sure people care about the CBO score, but they care if they're among the 24 million who lose their health insurance. And one of the problems Republicans are having now is that the constituency that Paul Ryan cares about, which is a Republican small government, let's free up the markets constituency, is different from the constituency that got Donald Trump over the finish line in the election, which includes a lot of people who maybe aren't especially interested in a smaller government. They're interested in a government that helps them get a job or keep their health insurance. And the fact that the people who are worst under the Republican plan are older, lower income Americans who make too much to be on Medicaid, but are maybe making $30,000 a year, they're going to see their premiums go up in a way that is not sustainable for them, where they have to spend 60% of their income on health insurance premiums, which is not something, of course, anyone can do in that.
And the choice of that setting tonight for that speech is a key one. I mean, and the next one that we have just on Monday. I mean, Tennessee and Kentucky. Tennessee alone, particularly in Nashville. I went out there to do some reporting on Obamacare, where they're seriously having real issues. Small business owners, a lot of independent contractors out there who just weren't finding options as the market shrank. So that message of Obamacare is failing may resonate. But what I didn't hear the president articulate is, here's what I'm going to do for you now. There was no detail in that. There was no policy pitch in that. And as you point out, on something like this isn't about politics. This is about the kitchen table. This is healthcare. People live with that. And that's going to count in 2018 for these down ballot races.
You do get a sense almost that the president would really like to sort of be able to put all this aside and sort of go to his bread and butter, which is immigration, which is any other jobs.
Brand Trump.
Exactly. I mean, it does not seem like an argument he's terribly having a lot of fun making.
Right.
His heart seems a little less in it than it would like on some other things. So, I mean, we'll see. But I mean, as Major said, I mean, this is the kind of thing that stands right in the way of everything else he wants to do. I mean, there's no turning back now. It's not like you can sort of say, all right, we've gone a few feet ahead, but now we're going to just start again and we're going to just like do a do-over and now we'll go to jobs. I mean, they're kind of stuck with this for now.
Well, Susan, I think one of the bigger questions in Washington is who pays the price for this, either not getting over the finish line or not ultimately paying off. Paul Ryan has been most publicly associated with this plan that the president's out there selling, a president who is known for putting his name on a lot of things, but not calling this yet Trump care. Is that a realization by the White House that this is really risky, or why is that?
It's hugely risky for all of those involved. So if the congressional Republicans, after 7 years of saying, elect to put us in power and we will repeal Obamacare, if they finally get in power, holding both houses of Congress and the White House, and they don't act, that I think is very serious for their constituency and for their credibility. But President Trump has talked about, I could just let Obamacare collapse and then the Democrats will come in and help me. Well, the problem with that political analysis is that he's the president. And I think Americans expect the president. And his party controls the government. So it seems to me it's hard for him to, if the healthcare system goes into, if there's no replacement, but Obamacare continues to have problems, as it does in part because the Republican government is refusing to do some of the things that were encouraging people to sign up and so on. It seems to me he is still left with trying to lead the nation out, especially since that is his fundamental argument. I'm a businessman. I can get things done where your government leaders have been failing you.
Right.
Susan Page, thank you very much. Mark Leibovich, always good to have you here in studio. Stay with us here on Red and Blue, because coming up, a former top State Department official will join us to weigh in on Rex Tillerson's maiden voyage to Asia as Secretary of State, a region still reeling from North Korea's missile test just last week. What is happening with the Trump administration's foreign policy? We'll hammer that out. Plus, did somebody try to kill Roger Stone? The longtime Trump confidant is reportedly claiming he was the victim of a suspicious hit and run. That says, well, he says at least, it could be related to the Russian hacking scandal. There's a lot of question marks around this, but we'll bring you part of what he says the story is next. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson landed in Japan today, his first trip to Asia as America's top diplomat. He landed in Tokyo late Wednesday and will also go on to visit over the next few days South Korea and China. But some headlines are overshadowing the importance of his visit to a region still rattled by last week's missile test by North Korea. The Secretary of State appears to be doing things very differently than his predecessors. That's viewed as a virtue in the Trump administration. But the Secretary of State has decided to shun the entire diplomatic press corps, deciding to fly all the way to Asia without any of them on the plane, and shunning his press pool, which is dedicated to cover at all times the movements of the Secretary of State, instead deciding to take one reporter, one who doesn't normally cover the State Department. Is this strategy? Is this something else? Well, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State P.J. Crowley is here with us now with some perspective. He's a professor at George Washington University and also the author of Red Line, American Foreign Policy in a Time of Fractured Politics and Failing States. So, P.J., some people might look at this and say, well, President Trump said he was going to upend the Washington narrative, break apart the establishment, not taking the diplomatic press corps. Maybe that's a good choice for the Secretary of State. Why does it matter for America's diplomat to travel with the press?
Well, I think there's a broader context here. I mean, traveling with the foreign press, it's a chance to amplify both to a domestic audience and to an international audience, what the Secretary of State hopes to achieve, what he's doing on behalf of the American people, and how he's pursuing shared interests with America's friends and allies around the world. But the larger context is a muting of the State Department. As you know well, Secretary Tillerson has made some brief statements in Germany, in Mexico, here in Washington, hasn't yet had his own, press encounter. And in the absence of a full team, you don't have that, undersecretaries of state, assistant secretaries of state, who are themselves going around the world,
bees.
right, and beginning to articulate,
right,
what a Trump foreign policy is all about. So there's just this kind of mystery that's overhanging the Trump administration and the State Department as Secretary Tillerson gets started and as the Trump administration begins to flesh out their foreign policy.
Well, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, often said diplomacy flourishes in darkness like mushrooms. I'm mangling the exact quote, but that was the idea, that stealth diplomacy can actually be really useful. Why is that not the case in this situation?
Well, I think there's the Secretary is finding out that it's very different to be a CEO of a multinational corporation who can literally fly around the world under the radar, and being the Secretary of State, the chief diplomat for the United States.
Representing America.
The most influential country in the world. And the light is just not much brighter. I mean, it's not to say that he won't get coverage, he will, but we have this ironic situation, in this global information environment that when he met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Europe, the Russians were far more forthcoming about what was discussed in that meeting, the Americans. And absent his normal megaphone, either the press events that he does or having a travel and press, where he can communicate, how his trip is going, it will leave someone like the Chinese to fill in the blanks as to what their discussions. And obviously, we don't have the same perspective on some of the key issues that the Secretary will discuss.
Well, that's the diplomat in you. We don't have the same perspectives. And I've been with multiple secretaries of state as they have argued for American journalists to be in the room, because Chinese journalists certainly aren't given the same access, because it's not viewed as a value in the same way that it is here to have a free press to buttress a democracy. But broader perspective here, Secretary Tillerson lands in Asia at a time when concern is only increasing about North Korea's nuclear program, its missile development, and the Trump administration is still crafting a policy here. What can he actually say when he's in Beijing, Seoul, and Tokyo?
Well, I think there are no good options when it comes to North Korea. The real question is, what is the path forward? Everyone seems to be pointing towards the resumption of the six-party process, some sort of dialogue.
A big group, sort of diplomatic process.
With North Korea. The dilemma is that North Korea is trying to rewrite the essential bargain that the international community has been negotiating for more than 20 years. The deal has always been that North Korea can have a normal relationship with the United States and the world in return for denuclearization. What Kim Jong-un is trying to do is say, I want a normal relationship with the world, and I want nuclear weapons as the ultimate insurance policy, for the preservation of his regime. The secretary I presume the secretary will be negotiating a early visit by President Xi of China, to the United States next month. But he'll be looking to see, will the Chinese follow up on the one gesture they've done recently, which is to suspend, coal shipments to North Korea. Will they put more pressure on North Korea to come to the bargaining table? The Chinese themselves are very frustrated. Kim Jong-un has yet to make a trip, to Beijing. So the Chinese don't necessarily know this guy a whole lot better than we do.
No, and to be fair to the current administration, the previous one didn't get very far in any kind of diplomatic outreach to North Korea. The attempts to cut off its missile program through cyber attacks and others didn't stop current development. Maybe it slowed it. They continue to take Americans hostage. There are 2 Americans in prison there right now. So this is sort of in some ways either forcing a total change of policy or saying, just keep muddling along here.
Well, I think the muddling along has been the strategy for the last few years, but the dilemma is the trajectory, that North Korea, as it tests, continues to make progress both on its missiles, and one has to assume
by 2020, able
in
to
the
hit US
miniaturization
territory
of a nuclear weapon, so that at some point in time, perhaps in the Trump administration, Kim Jong-un might be in a position to stand up and say, I now have a rudimentary capability with the capability to attack the United States. And what does a U.S. president, could be President Trump, what does he do about that?
Here in Washington, we have 2 European leaders coming to meet the president. You have the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, tomorrow with the president, and then on Friday you have the German Chancellor. This with the backdrop of an administration that's questioned some of the basic foundations of the European Union and others that are very important to both of those leaders. When we see Angela Merkel and Donald Trump stand side by side on Friday, what needs to be said? Because there's a lot that was said on the campaign trail. A lot of criticism of Angela Merkel by Donald Trump.
Well, and you always look to see, what leaders will connect. And for Barack Obama, he relied very significantly on Angela Merkel. They had a very good, relationship. But now with the British preoccupied by Brexit, with Barack Obama having left the scene, the primary defender of the existing liberal international order is Angela Merkel, and she has, and I'm sure will express to the president concerns about some of the things he's said, some of the things he's done. The ban.
He's been harshly critical of her on her immigration policies. I mean, he's such
on immigration policies, on the future of the NATO alliance, on the complexion of Russia. All of these things will be on the table for their discussion.
That's going to be a really interesting press conference.
Want to be a fly on the wall on that one.
Yeah, I want to be at the actual meeting, not the press conference, because the most powerful woman in the world, as some call her, sitting down
I think that's fair.
with Donald Trump. It'll be interesting to watch. PJ Crowley, thank you very much for your time here. Well, up next, we're going to take a look at the headlines that will give you a head start for your Thursday, including the results of a key election overseas. Plus, what do President Trump and a Russian billionaire have in common? Not just dollar signs. A lot of questions from journalists and investigators ahead. And President Trump may have declined to fill out an NCAA tournament bracket, but that isn't stopping former Hoops fan-in-chief Barack Obama from making his selections public. We have the former president's Final Four picks. You'll get them next on CBSN. Here's a look at some of the headlines you'll be talking about on Thursday. The Washington Post is reporting that the United States is likely to send up to 1,000 ground troops into Syria. That would double the number of American boots currently on the ground in that country. It would lift an Obama administration cap. If given the green light by President Trump, it would significantly up U.S. engagement in that war-torn country. The Guardian's reporting that Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is on course to keep his seat after a highly anticipated election there. Rutte, who is currently in office, defeated far-right anti-Muslim challenger Geert Wilders. It was expected to be a tight election, but Rutte was able to keep Wilders and his other opponents at bay. And the Financial Times is reporting that President Trump's first budget is due out tomorrow morning, and it will propose deep spending cuts. What is being billed as the America First budget will reportedly slash funds for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the State Department, several other agencies as well. Defense, Homeland Security will see financial increases. Several people close to then-candidate Trump's campaign have denied having ties to Russia. And now one Russian oligarch is trying to distance himself from the president. According to flight records, Dmitry Rybolovlev's jet shared a tarmac with Trump's plane in North Carolina back in the month of November. Now, he allegedly was in Las Vegas in late October when Trump was there, too. And just last week, the Russian billionaire's yacht was spotted in the Caribbean near top Trump financier Robert Mercer's own luxury liner. What does all this mean? Well, journalist Ryan Chilcote has been covering Russia for the better part of 2 decades, and he joins me now from London. Ryan, good to speak with you. Who is Dmitry Rybolovlev? Am I saying it right?
Yeah, Rybolovlev. It's a very difficult last name to say. He's a very interesting character. So he was effectively Russia's fertilizer king in the late 90s and the first half of from 2000 to 2005. He was the main owner of a company called Ural Kali, which produces something called potash, which is an essential ingredient in fertilizer, and at the time really had, a huge amount of the world's market share, so it could kind of dictate prices. So it was a good asset to own, but he effectively got pushed out of Ural Kali, many people think by the Kremlin, and so he moved to Europe. And really started to, kind of live a lavish lifestyle. He bought a football team. He bought, most famously, of course, Donald Trump's home that he had bought to flip in Palm Beach for $95 million. He spent tens of millions of dollars on an apartment in New York. And he spent a couple $1 billion on art as well. But, back in Russia, he's really sort of not talked about in business circles very much anymore because he's kind of been outside of Russian business for a good decade now.
So outside of Russian business, is he in any way involved in Russian politics?
No, he isn't. And I think that's what makes this story so interesting. If you were to ask me of, say, the 100 billionaires or so that Russia has, where he would rank in terms of his closeness to the Kremlin, I'd put him in the sort of bottom 50. I wouldn't put him in the top 50. I certainly wouldn't put him in the top dozen. You normally think about sort of, when you think about billionaires in Russia, you think about Putin's billionaires, the sort of maybe dozen or so Russian billionaires that many people say sort of own their or owe their wealth to Vladimir Putin's rise. Well, he's not part of that, and he's nowhere close because effectively, ever since he left Russia, he's pretty much stayed out of the picture and tried to steer clear of politics.
On Wall Street, there's all this talk about Donald Trump when he was just a businessman having difficulty getting financing for some of his projects. There's been speculation that perhaps he turned to outside lenders outside the U.S. Is there any financial connection giving any of the banking ties of this billionaire?
Well, there's a possible connection, and that possible connection is the Bank of Cyprus. So Dmitry Rybolovlev was a depositor in the Bank of Cyprus, like many other Russians, and not only Russians, but in particular Russians, when the Bank of Cyprus effectively went bust. And as a result, he lost his deposits in the bank. This was in the early days of the sort of financial crisis in Europe. He ended up with shares. So at one point, he was the biggest shareholder in the Bank of Cyprus with about a 10% stake. Now, subsequently, he exited the Bank of Cyprus, and Wilbur Ross, our now Secretary of Commerce, led a team of investors in buying up shares in Bank of Cyprus and became the vice chairman. So there is a little bit of a connection there. People have asked, including U.S. senators, have asked, during the confirmation process, the Secretary of Commerce, when he was going through that, whether Donald Trump borrowed any money from the Bank of Cyprus. And they were told, at least one senator on the record, by Wilbur Ross, that no, he was not aware of any financial connections between the Bank of Cyprus and Donald Trump. Now, some people say it's odd that the Trump administration has refused to actually provide Mr. Ross's written answers to the senators' questions about the Bank of Cyprus. But, not knowing what those answers were, it's really difficult to say what's there. The other connection is, of course, that, and I know this is getting a bit complicated, but one of President Trump's big financial lenders was Deutsche Bank. Right. And the CEO, the one-time CEO of Deutsche Bank, is now the CEO of the Bank of Cyprus. But again, it's interesting, but it doesn't suggest anything nefarious.
Right. Tangential connections at the moment, but that's one of the things that people want to see in the now president's tax returns, to say, where did his financing come from? Where did his funds come from? And those answers haven't been given, so there's all this speculation. But before we let you know, I want to quickly ask you about the latest on this Yahoo hack investigation. 4 Russians are now facing charges for the hack, including 2 Russian spies. Will we see a response from the Kremlin?
Yeah, I think we probably will see a response from the Kremlin. It's late at night in Moscow right now, so I suspect we'll get a response tomorrow. So of the 4 Russians, 2 were sort of criminal hackers. One was arrested in Canada. The other is thought to be in Russia. And then there were 2, according to U.S. officials, 2 Russian FSB or intelligence officials that effectively had hired these hackers to hack into Yahoo and other accounts. So one of those 2 Russian intelligence officials is actually in a Russian jail as we speak. He was arrested about a month and a half ago by the Russians themselves on charges of treason, possibly giving the CIA information. Is this all extremely confusing? You bet it. But to answer your question, yeah, I think we will hear the Russians say something. And it's probably going to be along the lines of, we've heard this before. There's this big anti-Russian hysteria in the United States. We're always blamed for everything, and it's just not fair and unuseful. I suspect that's what the Kremlin might say.
I think it's a pretty good guess. That sounds like a good talking point, Ryan. Thank you very much, Ryan Chilcote in London. Meanwhile, Roger Stone, a longtime advisor and confidant of President Trump, claims now that he's been the victim of a, quote, suspicious hit-and-run car accident. The political consultant tweeted, quote, "The car I was in was just T-boned by a large gray 4-door with a dark tinted windshield. I was on the passenger side." Stone went on to tweet that he is okay and later credited the car's airbags for his condition. The crash comes after Stone admitted to CBS News in an interview that he made brief contact with the infamous Russian hacker Guccifer 2.0, responsible, of course, for the email breach at the Democratic National Committee last fall. U.S. lawmakers say Stone is among the many names of people, I should say, who could be investigated or at least questioned in regard to Russians meddling in last year's presidential election. In other news, March Madness is officially in full swing, and though President Trump says he won't fill out a bracket for the NCAA basketball tournament this year, former President Obama is keeping with his long-standing tradition and has revealed who he thinks will win it all. Former President of the United States has number 2 seeds Duke and Arizona facing off in the Final Four. On the other side of the bracket, he has number 1 seeds Kansas and North Carolina going head-to-head. In the finals, he's got one of the most storied rivalries in college basketball, the Blue Devils and the Tar Heels taking the floor. And in the end, he's betting UNC is going to go home with all the marbles. We'll see if that pays off. Before we go to break, Republican Congressman Steve King came under fire earlier this week for publicly supporting anti-Muslim Dutch Prime Minister candidate Geert Wilders. The Iowa Conservative tweeted an article with a caption that reads, quote, "Wilders understands that culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies." Many critics have slammed the comments as racist, and that's where Late Night's Seth Meyers picks us up.
First thing, you're a 67-year-old man. All the babies are someone else's babies. And by the way, we can restore our civilization with somebody else's babies, Beyonce's. She's having twins, and if I'm reading the prophecy correctly, they will save us all. Second thing, Steve King, what are you so worried about? Your district is 96% white. You're basically the manager of the world's largest Williams-Sonoma. Iowa's 4th district couldn't be any whiter if you carpet bombed it with Crest white strips. Third thing, you know you've really accomplished something when the guy who wrote Cujo is no longer the scariest Stephen King. And in case you're still wondering if your tweet was racist, you got a shout out from David Duke. As a general rule of thumb, when the former Grand Wizard of the KKK chimes in to say he agrees with you, it's time to re-examine your stance. If you make a pork chop and Guy Fieri says, "This is delicious," throw out the recipe. Side thing, why does everyone arguing for white supremacy look terrible? Look at these guys. Looks like someone left a master race in a toaster oven. They all look like the guy at an AA meeting who complains about how they used to have better coffee. Final thing, we don't need to restore our civilization. We need to restore our civility. Oh, is that what happened? Was it just a typo? I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. This has been a couple things.
After the break, our DeMarco Morgan will get you caught up on the rest of the day's news, including a new investigation into so-called ghost calls, how a cell phone glitch caused a dangerous backlog at 911 call centers. Elaine Quijano will see you back in New York on Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. You've been watching CBSN.